Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh. Today we continue our coverage of the Star Wars prequels with an episode all about digital cinema and the transition away from film to digital as the dominant medium in film and TV. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't, but Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, was the first major motion picture to be shot on digital video rather than 35 millimeter film, as was the standard at the time. And these days, shooting on digital is the norm rather than the exception. And Star Wars was right at the forefront of that change. So today, we're going to be talking about the differences, both aesthetic and practical, of the two mediums, film and digital video, and how Star Wars has always been at the forefront of change when it comes to the technology of making films, right up to the AR wall technology that makes shows like The Mandalorian possible. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by two guests live from Orbital Virtual Studios, director slash visionary AJ Wedding
Hello.
and cinematographer Leo Jaramillo.
Hey guys.
So first off, thanks so much for doing this. And I want to note for the listeners who maybe can't see that you are talking to me directly from Orbital Virtual Studios. So let's start off with just explain to us what Orbital Virtual is.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Some friends of ours were working on The Mandalorian when it was known as Project Huckleberry. It was super secret, and we had heard about this new thing that they were doing, and there have been previous versions of this where you have a green screen and you can put the live 3D content on the green screen. But this was the first time that it all kind of worked together. And as soon as I heard about it, I thought this is the future. I mean, that we're never going back. So I wanted to learn everything I could about it. And funny to learn that it didn't really work so well for The Mandalorian and had a lot of issues with it. So our thought was, hey, let's figure out what those issues were and how we can fix them if they are fixable, and make a system that is better for filmmakers, is easier to use, and actually works, really well. And so, that was the genesis of Orbital Studios in my garage about 2 years ago, with a little LED wall and a camera and good friends who are all filmmakers. And here we are now in sort of our headquarters downtown. It's working out very well, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually were, we had a movie scheduled. He was the VFX supervisor and I was the DP, and it was set for April 2020. And
Mm,
so we had this scene where Navy Pier's being blown up by a wizard, and the protagonists, very Goonies like, the protagonists are driving go-karts with rocket launchers on top, and they're like firing rocket so it was there. Most of the budget of this movie would have gone to that sequence if we had to shoot it practically. So when we had lockdown, we're like, hey, when this lockdown's over in 2 weeks,
right.
it'll pick back up. We have to have a firing solution for not spending the bulk of our budget in this one scene. And so that was the impetus for all of this. And then that's where he went down the rabbit trail. And then I brought cameras to his garage, and then we tested. And here we are. Here we are.
It's a classic story. Necessity is the mother of innovation. And then, with a global pandemic to kind of hit pause and give you the time to actually follow through on all that crazy stuff. But I think you really summed it up. The one of the undeniable advantages of digital technology of any kind is just making things possible in a cost-effective manner. I am curious though. I want to go back for a second. You mentioned that the AR technology that they were using, at the time, really experimental technology on season one of The Mandalorian, they were encountering some problems. And I'm just curious, one of the things I wanted to ask you guys, what are some of the things shooting on a stage like this with the augmented reality environment? What are some of the things that you have to watch out for, that you have to pay more attention to as a DP and as a director?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because depending on who you ask, the answers change.
Mm.
And especially here, because we've tried to knock down every problem that we could. I mean, I think that John Favreau will say, if you asked him, they weren't trying to shoot every shot with, in-camera VFX, final pixel. They thought, hey, if we can get some of those shots, great. It gets rid of some of our comping that we have to do in post. But, seeing that could be achievable is kind of what drove us to making the system better. I think in their case, the camera had to be so far away from the wall. I think it was like 15 to 18 feet in order to not get moire. You're sort of limited by the frame rates and the shutter angles that you can shoot, which is more of a Leo thing. And
Yeah, and if like going with his 15 to 18 foot range from the wall, if you know cinematography, you know that if you're at a table and a character stands up, classic Western saloon type thing where he stands up, and then as a camera operator, you're going to have to hold the top edge of the frame for headroom. You're going to have to tilt up. So if you're 15 to 18 feet from a wall and you tilt up with a 35 millimeter lens, guess what? You see the top edge of the wall really fast. So that means that when you build it, that means they have to build it in such a way where it's almost like a dome, like it covers everything. And so that means that the sheer size of the wall and the limited space of shooting area within that stage, it can be a detriment to your overall production and cinematography, and it limits your lenses. So if you look at the original series, you'll see that a lot of them were like 50 millimeter, 85 millimeter, 110 millimeter lenses on close-ups. And then there's the skin and light issues and reflections.
yeah, so I think a lot of those things are sort of the first things we tackled. So like in our stages, you can get within 3 feet of the wall with the camera. Not like you ever need to get closer than that. I think you can do other shutter angles. You can do frame rates. We wired this wall so that you could do 120 frames a second as long as your assets can hold up to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think for A&E, we actually did a glass break scene that we shot at 96 frames a second with
72 shutter.
Unreal.
Yeah, with a 72 degree shutter angle, which is hard on digital. I mean, if you think about shooting a TV back in the old film days, changing the shutter angle to 144 or 167, depending on the TV and the maker. And it's like, yeah, it's very similar.
Yeah, I think that the limits are going away, right? If you're here at Orbital, a lot of the limits that you hear about at other places are just not there. I think the thing that you could really focus on as a director is what incredible opportunities you have. So like, for instance, let's say we put a car in here and we don't have a techno crane. So we want to get a shot that's looking at the driver and then goes around and gets a profile of the driver, right? I could put that car on a turntable and we can track the turntable to the world.
Right.
So as the car moves, the world moves. We actually did a project where we tracked the world to a mocap actor's hand. So as they raised their hand, the other actor who is safely sitting on stage looks like they're being picked up by Godzilla, basically, and brought up into the air. So there are just so many things that you can do when you start to realize that if you can move the world, you can kind of do anything.
And you can also control the sun and the moon and the rain. So you can have magic hour forever or blue hour, which is even harder to get because no one wants to get up at 3 and get up to a top of a mountain and ready for blue hour, which is 9 minutes or at best, So,
yeah, I think what was the movie? Was the musical about L.A.?
Oh, La La Land?
La La Land.
Yeah.
They talk about the dance sequence that they had where it was sunset and how it took them weeks to shoot that.
Yeah.
Like you could literally do that in one day here.
Yeah.
Before lunch.
Yeah, before lunch.
Before lunch.
Yeah, in fact, we did History's Greatest Heists, where we had Pierce Brosnan. And the idea of the show is that it's all these recreations of these heists. And as the host, they want him to look like he's there. But of course, he's not going to show up for all of these, heist things. So we were able to create backgrounds and then some sort of foreground set pieces so that he could come in and shoot out the entire season in 3 days. And I think it was like, what, 38 setups in 3 days?
38 setups in 3, and his days were limited to 6 hours each day because he's,
Pierce Brosnan.
he's Pierce Brosnan. He can ask whatever he wants. And so we would always finish every day before lunch with him. And then we would pre-light for the next day so that it was clockwork. And he
Wow.
would step off stage, and we would be in Amsterdam here on the stage. He'd step off, go to the green room. Halfway to the green room, the second AD would say, "Sir, they need you back." And then he comes here, and he's a airport hangar in Anaheim or in Orange County, and then he takes off again, comes back, and he's in what's the German airline?
Lufthansa.
Lufthansa. He's in a Lufthansa cargo building, and then it's just, and then he comes back, and then he's on top of the roof in Spain. It's crazy. It was crazy. It was like one of those things.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people, when they think about virtual production or in-camera VFX, which is what we call it, or AR wall technology, we're all trying to say the same thing, but everybody kind of has different vocab. But I think everybody points at the stages as what it is, right? It's this beautiful LED wall and a tracking system, but that's really only part of it. I think that the biggest part of it is the efficiency you create by having these tools in pre-production. So for instance, if I have the set, both the real version, what was going to be actually physically built, and also what's going to be in the wall, the production team can all use that. The director can use it to create storyboards. The DP can light it.
Weeks in advance. Because we know the light, we know the weather, we know everything about what the setting's going to be.
And then it becomes so much more efficient, which this is already a very efficient process, but then you've got all your department heads working out of the same document. And
Literally.
Yeah. And as it's changing and getting better, and, production designer can go, "Oh, I don't like that red and how it looks on the wall. Let's change it to turquoise or whatever."
Right.
So it's really a fantastic production method more than it is a stage.
It's almost like you can teleport your entire department heads to the location and the time and look at it and go, "Okay, this is what it's going to look like." Okay, great.
And they can all be on other shows at the time.
Yes.
And literally just like zoom in or VR their headsets in, whatever.
It's funny, like as someone who thought that I had wrapped my head around a little what this technology was capable of, just hearing you talk about it, makes me realize that I haven't even really scratched the possibilities. One question I had for you, AJ, was just something you've said before, but the phrase, "when you can move the world." Like that, I think, really changes the way you conceive of the whole production process. So many of the limitations or restrictions that you had to contend with, like now that you can literally move the world, I mean, I'm just wondering, are you still constantly like unlearning what you have learned and being like, "Wait a minute, I don't have to do this. Like I can just, why don't we track it to his hand and we can do this shot that I never would have conceived of prior?"
Yeah, I think that it's so exciting every day around here because we're constantly, there have been multiple times where we were the first people to do something. And it
feels pretty good too.
Yeah, that's exciting.
It's so fun.
and to walk around and think, like we were just talking about today, we've had a couple of tests at this where it's like, hey, what if we didn't even have a set? What if you could create like a hallway kind of maze, and we kind of go through it and showcase how close we can get to the wall and what that means for the kind of shots that you could get, especially if you had to do something quick. It's like, hey, you're making Alien and you've got this big, huge, elaborate set over there, but we just have this walking hallway shot. We don't really have 300 grand to build a set for it. Can we just throw it in the wall? And so, we tested that. We're about to test like a bigger version of that. So, I mean, yeah, we're constantly exploring the new ideas. I mean, just this past week.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So, a lot of times people talk about how long this stuff takes, and, oh man, I got to hire the director and the DP like a year in advance because they got to make lighting decisions. And that's just a poor pipeline that's being used. We're trying to push the new virtual production pipeline, which is much shorter because you're not tied to all of the software that visual effects companies are used to using that are slower. And so, like, for instance, we had this shoot that changed their days on us. And so we all of a sudden had an open day where we were going to have all this equipment that they already rented, and it's just going to sit here, and they already paid for the crew. And we were like, what should we do? So I wrote a script. We found some assets
On a Thursday
on a Thursday
afternoon.
We found some assets on the marketplace that we could take, the Unreal marketplace, and then, zhuzhed them up and made them a little bit more custom for us, and shot the next day an entire short film in a galactic Senate kind of environment
That's about to be bombed from space.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Just real quick, and did some things like going up and down stairs, which I haven't seen done yet in virtual production.
And we're on the small stage right now, which is like 50 feet in diameter. And so AJ had written a walk and talk, and it was funny because I think we hit that same aha moment. Because we're like going through like the dialogue and like, wow, we're going to run out of space on this 50-foot, because we're not going to use the outer edge of the 50. We'll probably be closer to the center, because of the proximity to the wall. So it's more like 10 or 15 feet. So we needed about 30 feet of walk and talk space. But then we were like, wait, you're going to cut to the overs, the French overs, rather than the front view, right? You're going to cut to the overs on the others, and intercut between that for this walk and talk. So we essentially could shoot the walk and talk in one direction and then change the world, like reset the world and reset them from the reverse, the reverse, and then continue it, because then you would have because no matter what, you'd cut into it. So it was like, whoa, we just extended the walk, and it was
and like instead of moving,
I see what you're saying, because no matter what, you're going to be cutting into it, so it doesn't matter if you're shooting it from the other side, because it's still
right. And instead of moving all of your gear and all of your lighting and everything, we literally just turn the world around and start shooting.
That's mind-bending.
It's really, it is. It really, once you start, it's almost like, I don't know. You ever play Super Bomberman? That's how I know this is so random, but like once you understand the physics of Bomberman, and then you're just like, oh, if I do that, it does that. If I do, and then that's what virtual production's like. And you start to understand the mechanics of it. And you're like, and then you drive home and you're like, oh, wait, that means we could do that with water. That means we could do that with a tracking shot. That means we could do that. And it builds it's a very fun playground. Very fun as a cinematographer.
No, I can imagine. Like you've opened up a new dimension, so you have to train yourself to start thinking in that dimension. But then I realized, but no, like this has opened up multiple new dimensions at the same time. So it's sort of it's like, yeah, I can imagine the only way to really wrap your head around it and figure out how to utilize it is to really immerse yourself in it and be doing it over time.
Yeah, every project we do, we learn something new, and kind of like tying it back to sort of the Star Trek, Lucasfilm, ILM kind of thing. I mean, they did this this was an evolution, obviously, but they did this to solve a problem. Like, how do we make a Star Wars TV show on a budget? And so that was their solve. I feel like they're constantly, Lucas, when he made the switch from film to digital, much like we've demanded from the people who make the screens and the people who make the tracking systems, he was able to demand from Sony, very specific things that he wanted about the cameras. They were making digital cameras, but they were like 30 frames a second or 60 frames, and he was like 24, and they're like, that's hard.
You're right. The Sony F900 and with the Digiprimes, that was I think the makeup of the episode 2. But yeah, he had demanded like yeah, you had demanded 24 frames on that. Up until then, all those broadcast video cameras were 29.97. So because the frame rate mattered, like
See,
we
see, that's really interesting. I can recall as a, young student filmmaker, the vast majority of the things I shot in school were on video. The problem with video was always it didn't look like film because of the frame rate. Obviously, there are many, many other differences, but that frame rate, the 24 frames a second versus 30 or 60, was really that like holy grail of that film look. It's just really interesting to hear, George Lucas was also coming up against that same limitation and was like, no, no, you guys, it's got to be 24p. One of the things that I am curious about, I think a lot of people may not realize who aren't so into film, is that subtle but very clear difference, even if you're not consciously aware of it. The difference between that film look of 24 frames a second that you associate with drama and with, stories and feature films versus 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second, which is a smoother motion that should read as more quote unquote realistic because there's more information there. But we associate it with, news coverage and with things happening in the now. So when you shoot the wrong, I'm using air quotes, the wrong frame rate for the kind of project, it completely alters your perception of what it is that you're watching. And I'm just wondering, do you guys think that 24 frame versus 30 frame per second distinction is just something completely arbitrary because of it's just what we're used to? Or do you think there's something sort of inherent in the 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 quality of it? I know this is a, a little sort of an esoteric question, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that film look. Is it just an accident of technology, or is there like something inherent that makes it more desirable?
I mean, I think it came out of animation, right? They realized that the lowest frame rate that your eye didn't notice the the changing of the frames was 24, and so it was the most economical way to create something.
Right,
But
because
then I think,
fewer pictures that they'd have to draw.
yeah, and so I think from there I think the romance of film, right? I mean, we get so used to it when someone does something different, like The Hobbit.
The Hobbit,
It's
yeah.
like, what are you doing?
right. And also, like, there is, I mean, obviously you have 60 versus 60 frames. There is a lot of information there, and you called it smooth. Um, However, at 24 or 23.97, which we're at now, there's so much motion blur in between the frames. There normally would be that crispiness, with 30 and even 60. And so that motion blur kind of, for me as a DP, it kind of feels like a memory. When you're watching a movie, it feels like a memory. And because you kind of remember things in like in kind of for me, I don't know, maybe I have been known to be a little nuts. So I remember things in blurs. I'm like, oh yeah, there's that, and then there's that, and it's never been that lucid, super clear, image in my head of a memory. It's always like, oh yeah, that feeling. And so the idea of using more of your senses rather than just your eyes, but just your heart and like how you feel in it kind of lends itself for me that adds to the romanticized view of cinema and at 24 frames.
Yeah, there's also that feeling of, oh, I'm watching a story. I'm part of a story.
Mhm.
Um, it's like when the TV manufacturers started making it so that they could fix it and make it higher quality, and everybody went, no,
Yeah.
Mm.
because look at that and it looks like real life. Is it better quality? Yeah,
Yeah.
but it takes you out of it. It's like, I'm not watching a movie. I'm not a part of a story. I'm in real life. And I don't want that. I came to the movies to see a movie.
Yeah, I've had full on crews that we were we'd take over a hotel, very similar to Tropic Thunder, and we'd go in, and rather than have those crazy parties, all the DIT and the ACs, we'd be going to everybody's room, like taking hyper smooth down, and then resetting the TVs and then like going, okay, Ramada and or wherever, and they're like, we've done our deed for the cinema world. Let's go off, and like that's yeah, that's a fun.
That's very funny. I was at a doctor's office the other day, and they had the TVs on in the waiting room, and they all had that, like, motion smoothing on by default out of the box, and it was just I just had to avert my eyes. But it's so interesting, though, and I think both of you really said it in different ways. It is a feeling that you can walk backward into an explanation for why it feels that way, but it is a feeling that it's really hard to say definitively, "No, like, here's why this feels like this and this feels like that," which is, I think one of the reasons why film and television is so magical, because it is sort of like right on that line between the technology and the dreamlike perception of human experience. And it's sort of like where they meet.
Yeah, I mean, there's also there is a very, I mean, there's a reason why it was really hard for people to move from film to digital. I mean, at the time that they were trying to make the move, they looked very different.
Yeah.
And we've closed that gap, I think, quite a bit with the look, but there is still that sort of chemical, emulsion that just there's a, and in fact, film actually works better on these LED screens than digital does, which is kind of ironic.
Is that true?
And it's and what's and just I mean, we haven't even gone into the latitude of film and how, I mean, that's the other quality. That's what makes it feel real, because you don't walk into a room and everything's contrasting within 13 stops. Like
Right.
that's I mean, that's on a good camera, good digital camera now. I mean, I think they're saying Venice and 35, Area 35 are around, 15 or 16 or whatever. But I mean, like, there's the infinite, it feels like an infinite number on film, because you have this like, Florida skies, and then you have the dark undertones of underneath the car, and then you have everything in between, and you can still see detail in shadow, and you can still see detail in the clouds. So
Yeah.
that's what celluloid can do. And if that's what also feels like your eye, so that remakes the human experience, and then couple that with 24 frames, feeling like a memory to me. And we're just standing on the shoulders of giants, who have paved this way. And it's like, and we're like, oh, this is the convention, and it works. And there's a reason why it's worked. Stood the test of time for 100 years. So it's still working. You see, Cohen brothers are still making things in 24, or like all our heroes are.
Yeah, I mean, and you still have to shoot if you're doing like effect shots with like explosions, you still have to shoot film because digital doesn't have the latitude for it. So,
Really?
yeah, I
I
mean,
didn't know
unless
that.
something changed recently, but yeah, I mean, New Deal, when I used to work at New Deal Studios, we still up until I don't know, a couple of years ago, we're shooting explosions with film because yeah, you're going to miss out on the detail with digital.
Oh, that's fascinating. I actually had no idea about that.
Yeah, the highlights
Um,
of explosions.
yeah.
You have to get all that bloom. It's like there's so many different like shades of orange and red and white in that you just have to capture that the edges. Otherwise, it would be just up like a flash.
Right. No, that makes total sense. It just never wow, yeah. One other thing that struck me while you guys were talking that I just wanted to mention really quick is that the thing that I'm constantly reading about George Lucas, whether it's from when he was making films in the 70s or really working on advancing the technology of filmmaking in the 80s and 90s, is like it really frustrated him that he wanted to be able to do more than the technology was really capable of. Like the thing that really hit home for me is that he's editing film, literally, cutting film on a moviola or a Steenbeck. He already wants to be able to do non-linear editing. He intuitively knows that it would be a lot easier if you could just move everything around and just not be limited by that physical medium. And it's just striking to me that like your studio, I think, is really the realization of the dream for what filmmaking could be like, that he was constantly trying to move towards through all of his company's innovative work in digital technology. It always blows my mind, like nonlinear editing. Today we just call it regular editing. It's like, the Avid was the edit droid that his company pioneered. And everyone was like, what are you doing? Like, what are you spending all this money on for this thing that like no one is going to use? And it's just really striking to me, like what you described earlier, how you guys are on a stage and before lunch you're shooting in Amsterdam, and then you break for lunch and that you come back to the stage and you're on the other side of the world and you're in control of the lighting and the everything. And it's all right there and you can do exactly what you want. Like that's what he wanted 30, 40 years ago, and you guys are doing it.
I mean, he's certainly one of my biggest heroes. I think before this started, we were talking about the movie Tucker, A Man in His
Yeah.
Dream, and one of the sort of themes in that movie is, businesses hate innovation because it costs money, and you're not helping sell units. And I think that the film industry for the longest time didn't want innovation. The innovation was the art, and he wanted innovation. I mean, the film industry as it exists today is because of him. All of these editing
Yeah.
tools that we've had our hands on, at a young age to be able to play with, digital cinema. I mean, digital from a camera all the way through the projector is because of him. And um, the ability to distribute a movie across 3,000 screens at a push of a button instead of 3,000 answer prints that are, how much a piece, 110,000 a piece, it's changed everything. And I think that we owe it to him to continue to innovate. We owe it to the industry to figure out how to make every tool we have better, and better for filmmakers specifically, not just, better technology. One of the things we always talk about with this stuff is there is absolutely an art to it that people like Leo, very few people really understand. And there's a lot of misinformation out there that sends you in the wrong direction, which is unfortunate. And those are the kinds of things that we try to fight, because we know how valuable this tool set can be for filmmakers, and we don't want people getting the wrong idea or using it improperly and having a bad experience, which unfortunately there have been several of those recently, and we're sort of fighting back by saying, hey, ours isn't like
Right, not at our stage. I mean, and that's the thing, is like, as one of the DP here, helping develop it with AJ, and I come from the industry. I'm not a gamer. I'm not a video engineer. I am a union cinematographer living in Los Angeles, working in Hollywood, and so I know what the tolerance is of what directors and creatives need. So when he asked me to help him out and like help like shoot and do tests and create a workflow and a list of what to do and not do, and how we can make the not do into a do and make it better, then I was intrigued. And so fast forward to now, and I'll bring in a new director and I'll shoot the project here with them. And what's really fascinating is the freedom that I give the director, the creatives, the actors, by and using Orbital as a backdrop and setting it up so that all this is in place. But it's all in place, and then the director's there, and all they have to do is worry about the performances with their actors. That's it. And so what I get to experience is the punctuated creativity that leaps off the page with these performances, and I've seen the evolution of it in real time, and it's really, as a filmmaker, at my very core, not just a DP. I love movies, but to watch that evolution happen and go, wow, because now they have the freedom to express and they have the safety to express and the repeatability that the rainstorm's going to go from this side to this side, and she can, and on a cue, like look into a candle and blow it out at the right moment. Those are things that you couldn't control because of the weather control and all that. It's like it frees them up to have almost close to perfection of what they had envisioned without limitations. And that is a Pandora's box that you give to a director, and he's like, whoa, I can do anything. And he can, or she can, and it's wonderful. And then they might drive home like thinking of all the other things they could do. So that's why it's a box. It's not because it's a
Well,
bad thing. It's just it opens up for everything.
yeah, I mean, first off, I just want to say, like, you're energizing me creatively. I'm getting very excited just by having this conversation with you.
I've been telling you about it for a while.
I
I've been in our
I
tech.
know, I know,
I'm like,
I
Josh,
know,
you got
I
to come
know,
down on
I know.
stage. You'll blow your
I
mind. And you're like,
Life
yeah,
is
I guess
tricky. Life
whatever.
life is busy these days. But certainly you have, and I really do appreciate the window that you've given me into what you guys are doing there. What is interesting, and I want to be clear that this is not a negative criticism from my end. Like, I'm like really fascinated watching the technology, what it's capable of, and the evolution of it. And once you have the awareness that the technology is being used, like, I feel like you alluded to some, I guess, pitfalls that like you have to watch out for. I was reading one of the DPs on The Mandalorian was talking about the luminance issues and how when they shoot something that's supposed to be outside, like they go outside on the backlot so they get the proper luminance. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little for listeners who may not understand exactly why that is.
Yeah, I know Leo will have something to say on this too, because we heard that same thing and decided to put it to a test because, every time we hear something, they say, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. Those are the first things that we want to do. So we actually made a project with Sony where the idea specifically came out of that was, oh, well, we can't do bright daytime outside. All right, let's shoot something in the middle of a desert with a flaming crashed airplane and see what happens. And I think that part of it really comes down to you have these people that are controlling this wall, right? They come from visual effects or they come from gaming or even tech driven kinds of companies, and then you've got the cinematographer uh, who comes from understanding light and how to shape things, and they don't know this technology, so they're listening to those people that are running the wall. And unfortunately, some of the advice I think that is being given is incorrect. So one of those big things is that you need to have a full like LED ceiling capping the stage, and that you use that as a light. It is a really low quality light to try to use. I think it's good for reflections for something like the Mandalorian or a car commercial, but having room above you to light properly gives you the capability to do those things that, like you're saying, that DP said he couldn't do. And we've heard of multiple occasions where DPs who have a ceiling, LED ceiling, are ripping out parts of it to put lights in.
Lights in.
For that same reason. They have to shape the light and create what they're trying to create. But go ahead, Leo, because you shot the Sony project.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that was one of the other things is like, yeah, the idea of it doesn't feel like it's outside, like that was the misnomer that a lot of us were given. And so I know Sony felt that way, and they're like, hey, we want to see it done. So they brought their Venice 2 over. I think it hadn't been released yet, and we were one of the first to test it on a virtual wall. And it worked really well because what you do is you think about it like this. Remember those 14 or 15 layers of latitude I talked about earlier? And then
Mhm.
if you get the asset in that frame, like obviously anything above that is waste, right? And it would be like if you went outside and you shot and you overexposed the sky, but you got everything else. So what you do is now you think with what you control the earth with now, you're like, okay, let me get my highlights in these top 2, 3 areas. And then you can dial in the wall for the sky for that. And you're like, okay, maybe this very, very top one, we'll let that go, like to simulate the overexposure in outside. And then you can dial in the rest of the asset, and go all the way down to your lower levels. And then so that replicates your latitude. So then now you light the foreground in such a way, because think about, like, the latitude is locked in the wall. Then you light your foreground to match that, but you put highlights and you put other things within your character that's in the foreground at those top levels, and then you put the lower levels of the Mark, who is our one of our characters, and we'll send you the video so you can attach it if you'd like. We have a finished cut of it, and then you put him in and you light him the same way. So you're lighting both the asset and him in the same way that you would light outside. And you're trying to put them in the same levels, and he's like a microcosm of the background as far as light is concerned. And so now if you're pegging the digital camera at its highest levels and its lowest levels, and you have this scene with the shadows, the drop shadows of the airplane are at 1 o'clock, then psychology takes over, and it's like, oh, they're outside, and this is very believable. And then when people watched it, I know that all the people from Tokyo were in the back there. They were flipping out. They couldn't believe that this was on a stage. They were looking at the monitor, looking at their camera that was capturing what was into the monitor, then looking at the stage right in front of their camera, and they're like, "Oh, oh." It's like that the Jackie Chan meme, that I'm talking about. It's like, oh, like, how is this possible? And that was a riot. That was so much fun. And then it was just like, okay, we got to check that off. Let's do something else.
Yeah, I think there's also I've heard this a lot that well, the LED wall's not punchy enough to give you like some direct light. Well, don't use it as a light.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we tell everybody, like, stop using it as a light. It's a really, they have this thing called CRI. It was a color reproduction index. I think now there's it's SSI now, but we used to call it CRI. And the CRI of the sun, which is a perfect light with a perfect color spectrum, is at 100, right? And so all the lights on your set, you want to be as close to 100 as possible. Some of the newer lights that we're using, like this one there, it's a CRI of about 85 or 90, and that's pretty good. The CRI of an LED wall is 13. So don't tell me you're going to get good skin tones from something that has so many gaps in the color spectrum. So, I think the other thing is, that camera sensor is being pointed at a light, and we're trying to trick the sensor into thinking it's not a light. So you shouldn't use it as one.
Right. I mean, we've heard of methodologies. I mean, we like, my friends are on some of the major shows that you know of, but they've been told things that are like, oh, you know what? If you have a character standing there and you need more fill light on them, then, like, right where you can see here where this O is, imagine that as a big square of white and like emitting light. And they're like, and so to a game engine designer or somebody who doesn't have a color meter, they might think, oh, there's more light, right? But it's not color. It's not, and that's why, and so even though you put a big block of light on the wall, how are you supposed to flag that? Like, how are you supposed to cut it
Right.
and shape it? And like, if you want to do a Charlie bar across the eyes, or if you want to like do a teaser or a fade or something, how are you supposed to do that if it's like a cove of light that's 6 feet tall? And on top of that, like the color that touches the skin. I don't think it's any accident that Mandalorian wears a helmet.
Yeah.
Like, because the reflective nature of that it works great. But I know that there's other sequences where they show skin, but like, for the most part, he's in that metallic outfit, and it's like, oh, okay. Or stormtroopers, there's no skin. I mean, there is skin, but it's harder. It gets muddy.
Not very often. I think the other thing too is if you're in a big LED cove and you're using the ceiling and the walls as light, um, the camera sensor can make rounding errors on the colors. So colors are measured in nanometers, and I know of examples from big shows where they'll walk in a cast and they're wearing, say, yellow outfits, and you look at them and you see that they're wearing yellow outfits, and you look in the camera and they're orange. And it's because if the color is not being presented properly with the full spectrum of light on it, then the camera is not seeing that full spectrum and rounding in a different direction.
Hmm.
And that's, another reason why you really have to have real lights. And it's kind of like anything, right? I mean, if you go outside and you shoot a walk and talk down the street, you're still going to light it. You're not just going to say, oh, well, this is the light that would be in this
Yeah,
universe.
absolutely.
Yeah, you put the
Right.
sun in a certain spot and behind you and bounce for, whatever you're going to, you always have to craft and shape it for the story.
No,
Yeah, and I
100%.
think I know you're going to say something. Let me throw in one thing
No,
here.
no, go ahead.
My gaffer Hunter and I, we often we look at a scene and go, this the first thing we think of, like when AJ throws up the asset for the first time, he's like, hey, this is the next project that's going to be shot here. Let's take a look at it. So we look at it and we go, oh, it's a jungle sequence. All right. So if we were going to do this for real in the jungle, what would it look like? Like what, like we'd have, a crane here, a condor there. We'd have like a 40 by 40 fly swatter above so that to soften the direct sunlight, but we'd still push dapple through. So we start thinking about what we would do in the real world, and then go from there. And it's so you're like, and you're always like thinking in the real world, like how to replicate that light. What is that dapple going to look like in the jungle? Like how do we create movement of the trees? And so you're still, as a filmmaker, doing all those things, but you're using real light to do it as you would in the field. It's just you have this optical illusion as your backdrop to help you get most of the way there.
Totally.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I mean, it just seems like what you're saying is I feel like what, is always at the end of the day, the answer is you still have to light it the way you would light anything else. Something has made me think of it's not exactly what you're talking about. The space shots in Rogue One, for example, look so good. And I was trying to figure out why until somebody pointed out it's because they're blowing out the highlights like on the spaceships because when the sun is your primary light source and there's no medium to really filter it's this harsh sunlight. It's like if you look at video of like the International Space Station or the space shuttle or something, it's like the lights are really light, they're really blown out. So if you're imagining, well, if I was actually trying to shoot this giant fuck off star destroyer, how would I be shooting it? And it's like, well, you would probably be blowing out some highlights because it's so bright.
Call me up a Hammerhead Corvette.
That's my favorite scene. I'm glad you said that.
It's
Because you feel it. You feel that. Oh gosh, you feel that
yeah.
moment.
No, yeah, the
Anyway,
last like third of that movie is like perfection. So good. Um
or the last 20 minutes of episode 3, but we'll talk about that later.
Wasn't what's the guy's name? The guy who just did Andor,
He would
Tony
know.
Gilroy.
Tony Gilroy. So
Yeah.
Tony Gilroy, I think, was the reason for that last sort of 20 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
Which is, like you said, the best part.
So
Yeah.
good.
It's so good. I guess I just have a question. Well, I have two questions. The digital cinema that was on display for episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and then also episode 3, which is only 2005, is only 3 years later. So we're still talking about the very beginnings of the modern age of digital image acquisition here. Can you see the limitations of the technology then versus how it would look now? I guess what I'm asking is, what would a film shot digitally in 2002 or 2005, what are the tells and the giveaways in terms of the quality of the image, and what has been, quote unquote, solved since then?
I mean, Latitude. I've mentioned it several times, but I've shot on the F900. There's a fan film that was sanctioned that we did called Forced Alliance, and it was shot on the exact same lenses if I remember correctly, that was used on episode 3. I think that,
Wow.
yeah, episode 3. So they're basically the Digiprimes, the Sony Digiprimes. And they were good, I guess, for the time. F900, the workflow on that thing was clunky at best. The batteries would go fast, and then they try to, change the body, and then they added the Genesis later, and then the Genesis was like a tank, and it was whatever. It didn't. But Sony had been there all along, and so the latitude of digital cinema now, it's hard to distinguish sometimes if something's shot on film or something is digital,
unless you go to the set.
unless you go to yeah.
Because really the I think the greatest probably thing that's been solved is the sensitivity of the sensor.
Yeah.
I mean, you need so much less light now to create the same looks.
Right.
I was on we were on the show Justified City Primeval, which is coming out I think this summer, and there was a chance that they were going to get Quentin Tarantino to direct an episode, and because they knew that he was going to want to shoot film, they had to put in a lot more spaces for lighting, just in case he was. So we had all these extra rigs that were necessary if he wanted to shoot film. Of course, didn't happen. So all that rigging was done for nothing. But yeah, I think that's a big one.
Yeah. Media size is like huge now. Like with 8K cameras, 6K cameras, they can hold it. The F900 at the time was that 1080?
I think it was 1080.
That was a 1080p.
No, they shot
Wow.
Attack of the Clones at 1080p.
So nuts.
Which
Wow, I haven't even thought about that. So
which is crazy.
wow.
Which is absolutely
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah.
I think the other thing about that film, episode 2, also episode 1 and 3, is that everybody assumes, because we were talking about digital, everything's moving to digital, that everything you saw on screen was digital. And there are so many physical models that were used that we know several of the model makers, and they are indistinguishable from the CG assets. I mean, they look really good, especially for that time.
Yeah.
So I think that's
No,
maybe
totally,
the other
yeah.
thing. I think people don't realize also that, model making still has a place in cinema, because even with Mandalorian. So one of the reasons I ever found out what they were doing on Mandalorian was because a friend of ours was creating miniatures of some of the set pieces, because they didn't have time to create everything digitally. They wanted to scan miniatures. And so, miniatures are huge for virtual production as well.
Well, that's really interesting, especially because, yeah, you can create a physical miniature and then scan it, and then using your technology, you can, I guess in the old days, or in the days of the Star Wars prequels that we're talking about, like 20 years ago, you would shoot your actors in front of a green screen and comp them in. But, now you can literally have the miniature environment surround them. So it's sort of the best of all worlds there.
Actually, I'll give you one more, Josh. With a miniature, what you're doing is you're replicating real life, right? Like let's say do a cityscape, right? Like London in the Jack the Ripper time period, right? And now you have it in a miniature. So that means that you have to, with optics, you have to change the circles of confusion and the depth of field to match what that miniature is, right?
Right.
So that means that, a 2.8, you have this much in real life, but at 2.8 in a miniature world, you're like
That
right
far away.
in here,
Yeah.
right? This
Right.
little tiny little like space. So you put that on the optics on a miniature set in front of an LED wall. That means you can play the miniatures much closer to the wall, and the
Right.
light from that wall, even though its CRI is, not the best, but the
It's still
overall
interactive,
ambience
though.
of
Yeah.
it's still interactive. So you have Jack Skelton like on a broom. I'm mixing everything up right now. Jack Skelton on a broom with Harry Potter punching each other, like, and they'll be affected onto the miniatures' roofs, as they
Right.
they fly across. So like you start thinking in so many different levels with this technology, and it's really fun. And now you can drop the depth of field, So it's like micrometers, and then it looks right in the
Well,
background.
yeah, and like shooting miniatures, like we did with Fawn Davis, we did some spaceship tests
Right.
where, instead of having to do, your blue screen comping and trying to figure out what that match move would be in space, you can literally just shoot it with space and
Right.
and
Right.
actually
That's
have the
true.
move track. So it's pretty, it just opens up so many
Yeah.
doors.
I mean, the name Fawn Davis, right, Josh?
Yes.
Or I don't know.
The
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
So he was here and it was just fun watching him. Like we're both like moving around. I'm like geeking out because it's freaking Fawn Davis standing in front of me. With one of his models that he made, and he's like, wait, so that means you can just move the space? And he's like, yeah, we can move the space, and then it can reflect this way, and then he's like, whoa, so this is the shot, and he's got his little camera, and he's moving around. He's like, oh, that looks good already, and that's what we hear so much is, "Oh, that looks good already." And then, obviously we'd like to augment it with lighting, but to make it perfect. But
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That's
there it is.
another question I had just in terms of the differences in the mediums, something that I think a lot of directors, a lot of cinephiles find desirable is that quality of film grain that is something that just occurred naturally and organically when shooting on film because like you were saying AJ, it's emulsion, it's chemicals having a chemical reaction and it just sort of does what it does, and that's the look. But how I guess subconsciously when you're seeing a purely clean digital image, for some it's without that kind of mitigation of like film grain between you and the perfectly replicated image. Like I'm just wondering, do you encounter people who miss film grain or who say to hell with film grain, or is that something that ever factors
you just put
into
it in a
your work?
post now.
Yeah,
Yeah, you just gotta
yeah.
slap
It's
it on. Yeah.
oh, you can change how big or how thick it is. I mean, I was doing prep for a potential job, and this same thing came up. It was a 1970s TV show, and so we were experimenting with Kodachrome looks and like what Kodachrome really would have done if we shot it right now, if it still existed. Kodachrome 64, not the lower speed one, like the 15 or the 20. And then it was good. And then Aiden Stanford at Arsenal is like, well, let's throw some grain on it. And he's like, oh, that's too much grain. That wouldn't be on Kodachrome. And then you start dialing it back. I'm like, yeah, there it is right there. That's and then you lift it up a little bit. I'm like, because the grain added like it would feel like a little lower, and just because of the natural thing of grain, and then you just add a little lift, and then you're just like, oh man, that's pretty and I shoot a lot of film. I mean, my Instagram's, I mean, fistful of film. I shoot all kinds of film cameras still, but it looks great. Like he said, you just slap it on and then you can adjust the temperament of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can also just shoot film. I mean, uh the show Westworld, I think, did its season finale over at Nant Studios, and they shot film on the LED wall. So, I
Oh,
mean,
that's
that
true.
like I
Yeah.
said,
You could just shoot film on the LED stage.
yeah, and film actually is more forgiving in so many ways. It's actually way easier to work with because it has a global shutter. I think First Man, our friend Ian Hunter, was a visual effects supervisor on the show First Man, the movie First Man,
Yeah.
um, and won an Oscar for it. And that was using a big LED wall, which it was before we had really fine pixel pitch. So it was a 3 millimeter pixel pitch. So the camera had to be fairly far away. But because they were shooting film, the fall off on the lenses was such that you didn't see the moire. You know, you don't really get moire, I don't think, with film.
Yeah.
So that was, and they just shot film, and they didn't even think twice about it. It wasn't like, well, what do we have to do with the shutter angle? Nothing. Like it's
Yeah.
film. Just shoot it.
Yeah, because it's overall a softer look, and that's
Mm.
why celebrities had a lot of pushback in the early aughts when Red came out, and then all the Alexas and everyone started making digital cameras, and they immediately went from looking pretty good for your age to holy crap, look at those lines. And so then we have to do all kinds of things to the lenses to soften that up, filtration and nose grease and all these tricks. But yeah, like because it's so much harsher. And then you take that, not harsher, but detailed, I think is a better term.
Yeah.
And then you take that into, the digital world, and you have to, that is a factor, that's definitely a factor over film.
Though now we have live deepfake technology and
Yeah.
retouching that can happen,
Yeah. I was I
immediately.
was reading an
Yeah.
article about that. That's wild. That's really
What was it on
crazy.
us?
I don't
Wait, when does this?
think it was.
Wait, wait. So yeah, yeah. When does this come out?
Nothing.
Nothing, Josh. We're just
This
destroying
comes.
the world. But anyhow,
No, I'm sorry. It
guilty.
wasn't something I read. It was a podcast that was talking about what goes on with digital de-aging and nips and
Oh
tucks
yeah,
here and
sure.
there.
Oh yeah. I think what AJ was well, and hopefully this will come out in a different in a time where we can talk about it. But
No,
I know
yeah, I
that
mean
we're on the
this isn't going to come out until the end of May.
okay.
So we can talk about it.
Yeah.
No, so we actually just shot a project where one of the pieces of technology being used was a live deepfake. So one of the things, if you look at, say, Mandalorian season 2, where Luke shows up, and it kind of works, like it was pretty good, right? But not great. And part of the reason is because it was a post process completely, and the actor didn't get a chance to see like what it looks like on him as he's
Mm,
moving around. So you're not able to affect your performance. So, I shouldn't call it deep fake. It's actually called digital prosthetics.
Yeah.
So
So
the idea
mm,
of it is that it still requires an actor, right? And in this case, the actor was able to see what his face looked like, what it would have been a post process as he's acting. And so he can see, oh, if I do this, I don't look like that character. Maybe I should keep my head here. And oh, if I do that, then I look more like the guy. So it's a really great thing for that. And also, one of the biggest things that this is going to do for people is no more 9-hour makeup sessions for alien makeups. If an actor can just walk on screen.
pre-calls. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makeup
yeah.
pre-calls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, well,
And
that's true
you know
because I was.
what's crazy is this stuff that he's talking about. I mean, as I'm moving a light on our physical actor's face like this, I'm just moving it side to side. I know your audience is mostly audio, so they can't see my hand gestures right now. But as I'm moving it side to side, I'm watching the drop shadow across his nose of the what is it?
The digital
The
prosthetic. Yeah.
digital prosthetic person that it's happening instantaneously. My camera team, my lighting team, they're all just like looking at it going, what are we, what's going on? So, and then I talk up and like, which is really weird because the reason why we're doing this, and I talked to some of the people that not only is the asset easier, but because there's less physical stuff in the volume, it helps with the tracking of what's going on with the face. And I was like, wow, that's like a side benefit we didn't even think about. Like, and that's the thing. It's like every day it's like, whoa, that really makes sense. Because if they were doing it in a real place, they'd have to like track, they'd have to look at all the things that it wasn't and then isolate those and then just
Right.
track the face. But because there's nothing in this virtual stage, but we're in a physical, it looks like a physical space, but there's nothing physically here. And it's just like, oh, okay, there's another reason why virtual production can work really well on top of the multitude of them. So yeah.
No, that's really mind-blowing. So I'm just, thinking in terms of applications for a show like The Mandalorian or, like, sci-fi or something like that. So you're basically saying, not to mix my franchises here, but, say you have a guest actor who's only available for a small amount of time and, they're supposed to be a Vulcan, but they can't show up, for the early call. Like, with this digital prosthetics, you could just give them pointed ears?
You're so
Good,
funny.
good example.
Good example, Josh.
I think there's also sort of the controversial aspect to it, right? Where for Rogue One, they brought back Peter Cushing,
Peter Cushing, yeah.
right? So, And in this project that we worked on, they also brought back someone who's no longer with us. And that's another thing you can do. And it's going to be controversial in how we figure out who gets paid for that and
Right.
Right.
who gets to say whether or not that's okay.
Right. It's a
Yeah.
whole, that's a litany of things that,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I just make it.
Well, it is interesting. This isn't exactly where I intended to go with this conversation, but like there are a lot of these strange ethical issues and these like strange, well, who's responsible for this issues that are coming up right now with all of these AI chatbot technologies and generating images, and it's trained on the data sets of people's work who didn't necessarily know that that was happening and stuff like that. And I think something we're all grappling with right now is, how much is too much, and when does the thing that we love stop being the thing that we love, and it's something that's unrecognizable. Like I really do appreciate, Leo, the way that you're talking about the sort of the romance and the humanity of that's sort of inherent in these projects, because at the end of the day, I think, you know, all of this technology is really in service of creating something that's supposed to be very human. It's supposed to, really hit us on a visceral level. And, I think whether or not the technology that creates it has to, like, yeah, I guess I don't really know what I'm saying, except like I don't know where the line
I
is
think I
either. I
do.
guess, oh,
Yeah. I see where you're going. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like I appreciate your eye and your sensibility and like for lack of a better word, the romance that you have for all of this stuff. I think that comes through in the work somehow. It's not something you can necessarily quantify, but I feel like that like humanness comes through on screen.
Yeah, these are just tools, right? I mean, you can give these tools to anyone and they're not going to come up with the same creative choices, right? In the end, you have to have a passion for your project. You have to have a vision and you use the tools that are necessary to get the shots that you're trying to get and sell the story that you're trying to sell. I think in the end it's still the same thing that we've been doing for years and years. It's filmmaking. We talk about this a lot because people are like, oh man, you're not even going to need the LED walls in a year because everything's going to be digital. The actors are going to be digital. It's like, look, all that is probably true. We're probably going to get to a point where we can do a fully digital production, right? With mocap and whatever else. There's been versions of that already. But in the end, does it serve your story? And if we understand all of those tools and we use them to the best of our ability to tell the story, that's what matters. And things like Chat GPT, they're great for helping out, I think, with, I don't think of them as, creative tools. I think of them as doing the busy work I don't want to do.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's like write me a press release about and the properly formatted press release, or write me some code for this thing we're trying to do in Unreal. And then it writes you the code. And yeah, it needs a little bit of adjustment because it doesn't understand exactly what you're trying to do, but it takes away busy work and it allows you to focus on the creativity. Now, am I going to let Midjourney decide the designs of my characters? No, definitely not. But can I have it spin up some things based on previous artwork of mine or, to try to help educate people on what I'm trying to do?
For sure.
Sure. I mean, I think it's valuable as long as it doesn't become a crutch.
Yeah, no. Um, it's interesting too because I think as with any new technology, like the use of CGI, computer generated imagery, I think, is a really good example where you see what's possible with it in those initial uses in the late 80s and early 90s that ILM did of like, The Abyss and T2 and Jurassic Park, obviously. And this is basically the cream of the crop, spending as much time, as much money as they need for these few shots. And it's used very judiciously because of how labor intensive it is and how uncertain they are. And then within a few years, you have projects where, well, oh, the CG can do anything. So let's just do everything in CG. And you start to see a lot of examples of the technology used poorly, where its strengths and weaknesses are on full display. And then you start to see people realize, oh, okay, well, maybe we only use this for certain kinds of things, or maybe we have to put a little more thought into when and how we use it, instead of, as you said, AJ, instead of using it as a crutch, where it's like, well, just let it do everything and do its thing, and whatever it is, it is. Similarly with digital cinema, like, I think there were some really interesting kind of experiments in the early aughts, like, I'm thinking of Michael Mann in particular with
Viper film
um
stream.
Or Miami Vice.
Yeah.
yeah, with Miami Vice and what was that movie
Collateral.
he did? Collateral, yeah, where,
Yeah.
he's really sort of leaning into the video-ness of the video, and, like, seeing what it can do.
He also did Public Enemies too, which was also that video, same camera, but it didn't look good.
Well, that Public Enemy example, I think, is instructive because it's a period piece. The quality of the image just feels, it doesn't match the content of the story, right? Whereas for
Yes.
something
Yeah.
like a Collateral, you sort of go with it, even though it's a little like, oh, that's a little not what I'm used to seeing, but it kind of works because you are used to seeing poorly lit streets shot on video at night, and it creates some kind of an eerie thing. But like when you're shooting something that the aesthetics are sort of inseparable from the content, like something that's a period sort of stylized movie, it doesn't really,
Mm.
the artifice starts to be like front and center, and you're aware that it's a film that's shot a certain kind of way.
Yeah, all those films had the same kind of look.
Yeah.
That Viper film stream kind of look.
Yeah. I think actually it might have been the F900 for Miami Vice, at least. Yeah, for Miami Vice, I think it might have been. You can double check. I don't know, but I know it's Dion Beebe who did that, and he also did Collateral. I think he took over. I think Paul Cameron was the original DP, and then yeah. So, but yeah, I think yeah, and then you're also there's one more. Zodiac was Viper Film Stream. That was Dave Fincher.
Well, see, Zodiac was really interesting because that kind of like clinical style of the film, I think, sort of worked with the style of the image. So, but that aside, like, there is something that I'm just curious to get your guys' thoughts on. So episode 2, Attack of the Clones, first feature film shot on digital video versus celluloid film, and then episode 3 obviously was also shot digitally. We come to the sequel trilogy and the new spate of Disney Star Wars films. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe all of the feature films have been shot on 35 mil again, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think a part of
Thank you,
that,
JJ.
well, yeah, so I think a part of that was setting all value judgments aside. I think there was definitely an attempt to recreate this kind of aesthetic experience of the original trilogy from the 70s and 80s that was shot on film and has a certain quality about it. And I think, even though there is a ton of CGI in the new Disney movies, I think there is a concerted effort to making these new films feel more of a piece with those original films. And I'm just wondering, and even to bring up the Tarantino example that you mentioned earlier, it's like there are still certain filmmakers who still want to shoot on film despite the potential of digital to be virtually indistinguishable if you're shooting it properly. Was it necessary for The Force Awakens to be shot on 35? Like, do you think that digital is in a place where you can still get that vibe, that look, and that feeling of, you know, 1980s kind of blockbuster filmmaking shot on digital video? Or do you think that that was sort of the way to go?
Um, I mean, I feel like the original series, the 1977, 79, and 81 were all on Panavision, and that was the not on in it. We haven't even gotten to the lenses, but Panavision lenses.
Hmm.
And when you return to film, you can put those Panavision lenses as well onto the Panavision camera and everything. But and I know you can use a Panavision lens on a digital camera, but I think the two of them together created that homage to the original series. And I don't know if that was intentional, or if it was just for the homage, or if it was just for the purity of it, or but it was very satisfying as a fan, and as a filmmaker, and as a cinematographer. It's definitely really satisfying that they did it that way. Um, and there's one thing that we didn't even get into, and I think we're already at a minute or an hour and 30. But when you shoot on 35 millimeter film, you got to remember something. A lot of 35, or a lot of film cameras, they have a video tap on it. And
Mm.
basically, the image goes through a beam splitter, and then the video tap spits out like a 480, or maybe they might have upgraded for JJ. They must have. Maybe it was like a 720 or a 1080 video off of a beam splitter. And so it's not very good. And so what ends up happening on a 35 set is the operator is on the eyepiece, and it's called an eyepiece, not a viewfinder. It's an eyepiece, and then the DP is literally right behind the operator, looking past the magazine, the 1,000-foot mag, and probably metering with a spot meter. And then right behind him or her is the director, who's looking down, and they're all imagining what a 50 millimeter looks like as Daisy Ridley is walking through the frame. And they're just seeing the direction of, like, I just know from my experience, like, seeing how the magazine points and turns, and like they're trying to imagine right over the matte box what it looks like. And then right behind that, the director is a production designer who's and they're all trying to visualize what the frame is. The spirit of filmmaking on 35 is that you are a part of it. It's not just data that's being recorded to a monitor, and everyone, like, if you've been on set lately, there's like 15,000 monitors everywhere, and everyone knows exactly what the image is. And you have art departments that have screen share on their iPhone, and they're just like, they're getting and they're moving like knickknacks and doilies across a table and going, oh, that's the perfect positioning right there. And it's not so much, it's a different methodology on being on 35 millimeter. And I think that might have been a conscious effort by our heroes over there, to bring that back, because that feeling on set is completely different than digital.
Yeah, and I think J.J. Abrams, Chris Nolan, and Quentin Tarantino, I think, are co-owners of Kodak now, right?
Yeah, I think they are.
I think part of that is to preserve that, preserve not just film, but that process that you're talking about. I mean, it's a very different kind of set. And I always say too, I sometimes teach film production class to actors, to give them more of an understanding of what it's going to be like on a set, at my alma mater. And so one of the things I tell them is, hey, look, all these digital cameras are great because of all the latitude they allow you as far as, how long you can roll and how many takes you can do. You're not, spending money. It's not $1,000 every time you roll out of a mag. However, people who have shot film have a different sensibility of the care and quality that they put into a shot, because they understand that if I do 3 takes of this, that's $2,000, and I have to really make sure that I'm getting exactly what I want. And that amount of thought that goes into the blocking, the camera blocking, how we're going to cut this together so we make sure that we're not wasting, makes you a better filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even when you go to digital, having had that experience, if you keep that, while keeping the advantages of, hey, we can still keep rolling because this actor is almost there and we can get him there if we just give him one more quick note, then you get the advantages of that, but also, the advantages of shooting film, which is that care and quality that goes into your shot creation.
Yeah, because you can hear the magazine rolling on a film set. Like, there's a little spindle on the take-up side of a Panavision, which is the rear one closest to the operator. And it's got like a little, like a zebra looking shape color. So like a spiral. So when it's rolling, you can see it like moving. And so if you're close enough to the camera, you can actually hear the motor, and it's like going, and all that is money,
Money.
like turning. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's like, whoa, this is real. And so there is an elevated awareness it permeates every position on a 35 millimeter set, because they can see that little spindle from a distance, whether it's sound or they're there. Yeah. Yeah. It's like that. Or there's,
It
or if it's
well, yes,
wardrobe or, yeah. And it's
very
like,
well
whatever.
recreated.
Yeah.
No, you
Well,
know
anyhow,
no, you know,
he spent a lot
it's
of money on with me. So
it's interesting too, like, I have cut a few films. I work as an editor, but I last used a Steenbeck in 2001, and I learned a lot of editing on, an actual flatbed Steenbeck, and while I wouldn't trade the tools I have now, there is something to be said for, when you want to make a cut, you got to really think it through because you have to physically cut that thing. You got to line up the tape, and if you messed up, you got to undo that very gingerly. So that the extra time that you're sitting there actually doing it, I think really kind of sharpens your sensibility. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from what you're saying about shooting on a set that's shooting 35. It just seems like, you really have to think it through. Well, guys, I could talk to you for hours and hours. You've been very gracious with your time, and I've really enjoyed this discussion. Is there anything that you wanted to mention or say that we haven't gotten to yet?
nib high football rules. Adam Sandler, wherever you are, I love you.
And AJ, if people are curious about learning more about Orbital Virtual Studios or seeing some of the work you guys have produced, where should they go?
So you can go to orbitalvs.com. That's Victor Sam Virtual Studios. Or they can follow us on Instagram, which is Orbital Virtual Studios.
And there will be links to all that in the show notes. I want to thank my guests, AJ and Leo, for a really awesome conversation. And again, like I said, I could talk to you guys for hours more. But
You
if
should
you'd like,
come to the set or come to
I
the
will.
stage, you know?
I will. I absolutely will. Life is tricky lately, but I will absolutely. I especially after this conversation, I'm vibrating with excitement about what you guys are talking about.
Wonderful.
If you liked what you heard, please visit us at trashcompod.com, where you can find transcripts of this episode and our other episodes. And we are Trashcompod across all social media, and we will see you on the next one.